Back in 2019, as the Amazon burned, French President Emmanuel Macron said that our house is burning and called for a discussion of the issue at the G7 summit, without anyone from the 5 affected South American countries actually being present. Brazil's far-right president Jair Bolsonaro replied, and within his tirade he said that the French president's suggestion that Amazonian issues be discussed at the G7 without the participation of the countries of the region evokes a misplaced, colonialist mindset in the 21st century. And you know what? Bolsonaro, in a way, had a point. Now, before you close this video or leave an angry comment, please wait. This is not some pro-Bolsonaro video. In fact, he sucks and I hate him. He was just appropriating anti-colonial rhetoric because it was convenient for him in the moment. Bolsonaro himself is basically colonialist Maximus. He doesn't care about other countries exploiting Brazil or anything like that. He's actually quite happy to sell his country off to the highest bidder. And he has abhorrent views on many things, including very relevant topics at hand like the Amazon, indigenous rights, and climate change. But the accusation of people looking upon the third world, global south, developing world, or whatever you want to call it, with an environmentalist colonial mindset is nonetheless a very valid point, especially in reference to the G7, which is made up of 7 of the world's richest nations and most prolific colonizers discussing problems in ex-colonies without them even having a seat at the table. Why? Well, let me explain. On this map, the redder that a country is, the more carbon dioxide gas it has emitted since 1750. That start point is used because it is around the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when man-made emissions increased exponentially, and CO2 is used because it's by far the most emitted of all greenhouse gases. So this allows us to take a look at every country and gauge how much it has contributed towards man-made climate change. Let's take a look at the historical emissions of France first, since it's the country that Macron is president of. France has emitted 37.77 billion tons of CO2. When we normalize this for population, we see that France has emitted 563 tons of CO2 per person since 1750. Now, this is an imperfect measurement since we're comparing historical emissions to current population, but it nonetheless gives us a good enough indication. Brazil's historical emissions, on the other hand, total 14.19 billion tons. But accounting for Brazil's much higher population, nearly 4 times larger, Brazil has emitted 68 tons of CO2 per person. That's 8.3 times less. Why does this matter? Well, the atmosphere and emissions into it can be considered as something of a global commons, a non-renewable resource that everyone has access to and uses. A developed country like France has built and run more factories, they have mined more, they have burnt more fossil fuels, etc. Perhaps they don't have Brazil be in every single individual category, but everything combined, France has emitted far more CO2 into the atmosphere. It's used far more of this important global common resource. And this is a really big reason why France is so much wealthier than Brazil, or why Japan is so much more developed than Indonesia, or why the USA is so much more developed than Bolivia. It's not the only reason, of course, please don't kill me, but it's definitely a big one. Wherever there is wealth, there is always proportionately large amounts of per capita historical emissions, and where there is poverty, there are far less. So when someone like Macron, the head of state of a country that has historically emitted so much more per person than Brazil, tries to police what Brazil can do with its natural resources without even giving Brazil a seat at the table, we have a bit of a problem. Brazil has not had the opportunity to use its fair share of global emissions, to develop in the same way that the 7 countries of the G7, along with many others, have. So while I don't agree with someone like Bolsonaro making use of this argument, I can absolutely understand where it comes from. Now, of course, Brazil doesn't need to massively increase land clearances in the Amazon to develop. Brazil can exploit other natural resources, it can build factories, or it can expand agriculture in other places or whatever, without unsustainably clearing the most important forests on the planet and burning indigenous land. But either way, however it develops, it's probably going to be emitting more greenhouse gases to do so, which is, along with colonization and exploitation, how every wealthy country in the world got to where it is today. So when people or powers in the first world look at third world countries and see them, say, drilling for oil, or building factories, or expanding mining operations, or expanding agricultural land to a reasonable extent, and they say, hey, stop! You can't do that. It's bad for the environment. Even though our countries have not only emitted way more than you historically, but we also emit way more than you still today. What they're really saying there is just, f you, got mine, hidden behind a thin veil of environmentalist rhetoric. You have to actually provide alternatives and work with these countries rather than just demanding that they stop and leaving it at that. You can't simply leave people in poor countries to wallow in poverty while you try to police their use of the same global common resource that your country used to get rich. By doing so, you're effectively telling them, whether you mean it or not, that their countries must endure the most substantial material costs of fighting climate change. I'm not talking about money here when I say cost, I'm talking about consequences to their material conditions. You're demanding that they stay poor for decades, or maybe even for a century or more, who knows how long it's going to take, until emissions are stabilized, all while you continue to enjoy a standard of living that is much higher than the global average. So does this mean that I'm against taking drastic action to fight climate change? No, not remotely. Aside from the coming alien invasion, climate change is the most pressing issue facing humanity today, but it needs to be tackled in a way that accounts for its transnational nature. There cannot be winners and losers, it can't be treated like a competition. We must all act as one to ensure that in, say, 50 to 100 years, once the drastic transformations necessary have been made, no nation has been left behind, and as part of that, we need to acknowledge the simple fact that the countries that have historically used way more than their fair share of emissions are much better suited to making the necessary changes first, in the short term, because climate change is just a whole lot easier to deal with in every way for a nation that's wealthy, developed, and politically stable. For example, renewable energy is certainly cheaper in the long term, but it has a high cost barrier of entry. Poor countries simply cannot realistically pay for that barrier of entry at present, especially considering that many of them lack pre-existing energy infrastructure in the first place. And in many cases, their governments simply aren't strong enough to carry out such far-reaching infrastructure projects. Even for a rich country, it's still a challenging undertaking, but it's one that they are much better equipped for. And such changes in wealthy countries would also drastically reduce global emissions far more than any similar changes in poorer countries would, even if such projects were realistically possible in the short term in poorer countries. Because wealthier countries have not only emitted far more historically, but still emit far more per capita today. Reducing emissions in a country like Australia or the USA, which each emit 16 tons of CO2 per person every year, would do far more proportionately than reducing them in, say, a country like Bolivia, which emits 2 tons per person per year. It's also much easier for rich nations to adapt to the effects of climate change that are already pretty much guaranteed to happen, and the effects that are already happening. Sea levels are going to keep rising for quite a while, for example. It's sadly inevitable that some cities are just going to be enveloped by the sea, or face much higher risks of coastal flooding. A rich nation can much more easily do things to combat this, such as by building seawalls. And if evacuation and resettlement becomes necessary, that's much easier to do for a richer population with a richer government that is more capable of helping them. In a poorer country, well, that city's pretty much just gonna be underwater, and the people who live there are gonna have to evacuate in advance, a cost which they're far less likely of being able to bear. Same goes for practically every possible effect of climate change. They all affect poorer countries much more. Think about, say, the bushfires in Australia in late 2019 and early 2020. Australia really struggled to tackle them, even though it's a rich nation with an abundance of wealth and equipment at its disposal. Now, think about the fires in 2019 in Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Paraguay. Even ignoring debates about the quality of their responses, imagine how much more difficult it is just by default for them to deal with the same, as they simply heavily lack the wealth and resources to invest in those same areas. Considering all of that, Even though I think that Bolsonaro's response to the fires was terrible, and that his climate denialism facilitates them, I can somewhat understand his reaction to Macron's statements. And I can, without those caveats, understand the reaction of someone like Bolivia's president Evo Morales, because what he said when the G7 nations pledged a measly $20 million to help fight the fires is grounded in the exact same understanding of the historical and present-day emissions of wealthy countries that I've outlined in this video. Morales said, "I welcome this small, tiny assistance from the G7 of $20 million. This is not help. Rather, this is part of a shared responsibility. All people share this obligation. The most industrialized countries should help more, and not only when there's fires." Parts of the international media, along with some supposed climate activists, treated this like it was some sort of irrational, offensive statement. But he was right. He was incredibly right. Spot on, in fact. Everything that he said there, regardless of whatever you may think of him outside of that one statement, is simply true, and none of this is controversial at all. Or at least it shouldn't be, because the recommendations of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are the basis for pretty much everything that I've said in this video. All that I'm doing here is just paraphrasing and simplifying the opinions of the world's foremost organization that synthesizes research on climate change and recommends action to combat it. And their work is also the basis for the solutions that I'm about to summarize. Rich nations, as we've established, are not only far more responsible for climate change, but also have much more wealth and resources as a result. Thus, rich nations need to make use of their privileged position and take the initiative by being the first to transition to renewable energy. This alone would already eliminate the vast majority of global emissions. Poorer nations also need to develop meanwhile. Not like full rapid industrialization or anything, rather just as much as they can in like a decade or two, proportionate to their current level of development. And that can be a whole lot. In just 10 years, for example, Bolivia tripled its GDP per capita, mostly through resource extraction and industrialization done in ways that ensured that most of the profit remained in the country rather than flowing out of it. This needs to happen even aside from just concerns about fairness, because well, as poor countries are now, they simply can't afford to rapidly transition to renewable energy sources, to more sustainable methods of development, or to adapt to the current and future effects of climate change that will devastate their countries. Even just 10 years of growth will go a long way towards helping with that, while barely affecting global emissions. By enabling these nations to build up the wealth, infrastructure, and stability that's needed to enable a transition to renewables in the near future, this strategy will easily pay off with more emissions reduction in the long term without any need for living standards to stagnate or drop. Additionally, rich nations need to compensate poor nations for the development projects that they think they shouldn't undertake, or help to cover the cost of more expensive alternatives. And when they're done with their own transitions to renewables, they need to help poorer nations do it too, or help out concurrently, even better. All of that is very simplified, and I'm leaving a lot out, but that's the gist of it. Now, perhaps some of you are thinking, but my nation has no obligation to help other nations. This sucks. I'm not helping anyone. And that's great and all, but with that attitude, how exactly do you expect to get poorer nations on board with tackling this massive existential threat to everyone's survival? And you're a part of everyone, by the way. Helping them is not simply fair and just, it's not simply humanitarian, it's also practical, because your own survival depends on it. The world needs to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions to zero, and saying that this needs to happen before the end of the century would be a big understatement. So poor nations, even though they emit very little in comparison, still have to stop emitting eventually too. And they're gonna be way less likely to cooperate if you just ignore the massive disparities that I've gone over here. And speaking of cooperation, that's the problem. The IPCC are just a bunch of scientists who look at the problem and advise on it. They have no power. Most rich nations, instead of just accepting their recommendations, see climate change negotiations as more of an opportunity to negotiate their obligations down as much as they possibly can. So every year, there's a United Nations Climate Change Conference, and every year, wealthy nations act like a bunch of selfish pricks who, despite pretending to care about climate change, are only willing to do as little as they can possibly get away with. So if you want to protest and speak up about the environment and climate change, and you're expending lots of energy on critiquing third world governments for trying to develop, just stop. Whether the people who do that realize it or not, they're demanding that poor people just stay poor. The number one thing that you should be doing if you genuinely care about this stuff is either getting first world governments to shape the hell up, or to organize the global communist revolution so that we can tackle the problem as one. Because those are really the only two ways that we have of avoiding some really catastrophic consequences. And unfortunately, I don't see many climate activists doing much of the latter. So there's certainly times where protesting environmental policies in the third world is still justified, like when indigenous land rights are violated, or with Bolsonaro massively ramping up the deforestation of the Amazon. I mean, he literally campaigned on its destruction, but hyper-focusing on more justified development there that would still not bring poor countries anywhere near the per capita emissions of the first world is just ridiculous. Like people who mercilessly criticize extractivism in the third world, for example. Extractivism is just a scarier word for exploiting natural resources. They do that despite enjoying all of the privileges of being from nations that have done far more than their fair share of this extractivism already. And many of those countries, also for centuries, directly extracted resources from some of the very countries that they criticize, robbing them of their wealth. There's maybe like 10 or 20 years at most before the third world will also need to start making serious progress on emissions. Provided that it is measured and respects indigenous rights, then the resource exploitation and development that happens between now and then is nothing more than the marginalized nations of the world finally taking but a small part of their fair share of the emissions global commons, before we all, hopefully, abolish our use of it altogether. In summary, it really is a colonial mentality to be from one of the many countries that exploited post-colonial nations for centuries, and to look down upon them and say, no, you can't do that same thing that we got rich off, without any consideration for their unique conditions, and without offering them any substantial assistance or alternatives. So, don't do that. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, why not subscribe? And if you really liked it and you have the money to burn, you could also become a patron on Patreon, send me a one-time tip on Ko-fi, or become a member on YouTube. You could also share it with your dad or whatever. You do you. Now I'd just like to thank all of my patrons, and especially my $25 plus patrons: Ferta Hon, Dusty, Mischief and Fins, A Big Mean Cat, Pote, Shub, Robert Dilling, Jesse Hosick, Super Pancake Man, Tonga Purutu Neha, and my $10 plus patrons: Young Trotsky, Christopher Strom, One Trash Boy, Violet Rain, Insurgente, Mitsuki Kazan, Jess, Mamushin, Audrey and Lane Thorne, Nico Del Sesto, Diego A. Salvati, Evan Rothwell, Cincione Bresgal, Joey, Morimer, Crouton Baguette, Christoph Kaczynski, Healers Alcoin, and Industrial Robot. Thank you. Bye.